I don't know exactly where he was originally from, but I suspect the Mediterranean or the Mesopotamian area. Tehut was my brother's best friend. Tehut was in his 50s when they met, and my brother was barely 20, but it was a friendship that would span millennia. We were all living in a beautiful little village called Kron, set on a massive lake. But this idyllic location was far from perfect, as there were raiders nearby that would regularly visit, terrorize everyone, steal what they could, carry off stuff and hurt us if we ever asked them to stop. And by hurt, I don't mean insult us. They were barbarians. They would kill, maim, or rape. So we just hid, and as long as we did that, we were usually physically unharmed. The story of Tehut started while Uran, my brother, was searching for a better location for our people to move to. And this was just after he'd had his first major epiphany, which resulted in the levitational and flight technology that we had in Tantal. Uran developed the first flying machine, and he used it to travel to faraway places in search of a new, safer location for us, his people. He was looking for a place where there were no primitives, but it wasn't easy, as humanity already spanned the globe. It was during one of these trips he came across an island where he saw a beautiful tower built of red blocks, or maybe they were red bricks, I don't know. But at the top of the tower was a light, or maybe it was a fire. It's all a bit vague. Uran was surprised actually to find such a great civilization. He thought that his people, that is us, were the only people that were not primitive barbarians. He decided to land, and he did it a good distance away from the city, and he walked to the highest vantage point where he could see the place. The city was beautiful, but there were not many people, and as he got nearer, he saw great pits with bodies strewn about. He could see that the few people who were alive were not doing terribly well. They effectively were dying, he could see that. And Uran didn't know why. And then suddenly a man approached him, speaking in a language he didn't understand. He looked healthy enough, not like the others, but Uran turned and quickly went back to his flying machine. The man followed. Uran took off, and the man just stared pathetically as Uran ascended. There was something about this man, a gentleness, a sadness, a great depth in his eyes, that made Uran return, and Uran signaled to him to come over, and the man got into the machine and they departed. The man, Tehut, wept, but was unable to express to Uran what had happened to his people, or to express his appreciation for being rescued. Being obviously concerned for the safety of his own people, his family, for example, Uran had a wife and at least one child by this time, I think. Anyway, Uran took the man to a cave. It was a place that Uran went often to think things out and work. No one else knew of this place, and even if they did, they couldn't reach it. Uran had a well-stocked larder for such times of reclusive contemplation, and so they camped there for 2 weeks while Uran tried to determine if the man, and indeed himself, now had whatever plague or disorder that the people of his new friend had. The 2 weeks they spent together cemented their friendship and enabled the two to learn a little of each other's language. It would seem that Uran had discovered someone almost his intellectual equal. Uran was a lovely person, but he struggled to think down to most people's level of thinking. But this was a man who was quick to learn and incredibly bright. We, his family, were very bright too, but we were not a patch on Uran or on his friend Tehut. Tehut learned our language quickly. It turned out that Tehut was not actually living in that city. I think he said it was something like Kairos or something like that, when the plague or whatever it was struck. He had actually been called to study at the feet of the Great One in the Temple of Light in one of the other cities. I think the name of that place was something like Simbaya. The reason I think that is because that's a funny song, Kumbaya. Sounds a bit like it, but it's not Kum at the start, it's Sim. So I think the name of the city is Simbaya. So, yeah, I have a weird way of remembering things. But anyway, it was far away, and he'd been there studying for over 10 years. And it was from there that he was returning, and that was several days earlier, before Uran came. He was returning with some others who'd also been away for quite some time. And as they all came near to shore, they could see the city and that there were some terrible things going on. So they weren't sure what to do, so they took their boat to a very nearby harbour, which was a fairly safe distance from the city, and decided to have a look at the situation from a different angle. As they came over the ridge by foot, it was clear that something was very, very wrong. Apparently, Tehut advised his companions to wait and not go into the city, at least a short time, while they could together determine what was actually happening. But his companions did not agree, and they immediately returned to their boats and sailed back around to the village. Tehut was wise. He knew that if it was a plague, he could not help them. He would just die with them. It was painful for him, but he stayed many days and watched, and more people were taken from their houses, clearly dead, and he knew he had no way to help. He was hoping to see some of the people recover, but once he had seen that only a few, in fact, remained at all, and his companions, the people who he'd returned with, were now also either dead or dying, he realized that he needed to leave the area, but no boat, and hence no way off without taking a really big chance of going into the city. That's when he saw Uran fly over, and that's how he ended up returning with Uran to his cave of contemplation. Once Uran felt sure it was safe, they both came out of the cave and returned to my family. Tehut was instantly accepted by both my family and the village. Some years later, Tehut returned with Uran to his original city. It was lifeless. They had a good look around. They were very careful, and they saw no one. It didn't look as if it had been disturbed at all since he'd last seen it. So the two of them took all the things that they thought were important or useful to our people in Tantal. I suspect that this is where many of the books came from that were around at the start of Tantal, but of that I'm just guessing. Tehut and Uran were very close, but Tehut was older than even Uran's parents. He was closer to the age of our grandmother, who was a widow. Tehut was very much enamored by our lovely grandmother. Even elderly, she was gorgeous. Within 10 years, Uran had founded Tantal, what I think is Atlantis, and had also worked out how to prolong life. Not massively at this stage, but at least an extra 30 to 40 years. And later, after much work, he actually came up with the cure to aging, and those who took it returned to being about 25 or 30 in looks and in health. Tehut and our grandmother were happy to be early adopters, as you might guess. The love between them blossomed even more once they regained their youth. I'm sorry that I can't actually recall her name, because for the whole of my life, She was my grandmother, and that's what I called her. She was my grandmother because Uran was my brother. So neither of us ever called her by any other name than the equivalent of grandma. Tehut was a very good-looking man, despite having a rather large nose. I can see him clearly in my mind's eye, but I guess his nose was really only large compared to the general features of my people. When I think about his nose compared to today, it was pretty normal. Anyway, his wisdom was unsurpassed, but he had a certain mystery about him. He often mentioned his teacher, the Great One, but said he could not return there, nor could he speak of where it was. So very little was ever said about the civilization that he came from, but there were the odd tiny hints and small comments, and I gathered that his city was actually just a small part of what had been a flourishing culture, but that some of the people had returned to primitive ways for some unknown reason, and that only the great temple retained the essence of what that civilization once had been. So it's not clear to me where this place was, or in fact what happened to the Great One, but Tehut once said that history has a habit of repeating itself, whatever that means. Uran asked Tehut to be part of his new university, the Great University of Tantal, which, as it developed, was then later split into 12 universities. Initially, all of them were located within Tantal, and they were later split over 10 locations. So one location is Tantal, and there were 9 other locations around the world. Some of those locations have been relatively easy for me to work out. For example, Egypt is Khem, Athens is Neath, and a place called Thebe, I'm pretty sure, is in the British Isles. Maybe even Doggerland, but I'd recognize those white cliffs anywhere. I mean, they were definitely the same sort of white cliffs that I remember from England, and I'm originally from England. I'm not totally sure of the 6 other locations around the world, but I have a lot of clues, and I also have a lot of theories, and I hope to eventually work out the location of them all. I think I'm pretty close to finding the location of the place that got named after Tehut, but we'll come to that. So Tehut was clearly well educated already, and he knew things my people, including Uran, did not know. Tehut and Uran taught each other much, and they both absorbed knowledge like sponges. Tehut would say that knowledge is the key to greatness, and it is like a light in the darkness. Tehut assisted Uran formulate the laws of Uran, including the last law, the most controversial law, which came later, which was a 1 child per person per lifetime law. And that was only because once lifetimes were indefinite, if people were having as many children as their lifetime made possible, that would have made an explosion in the population. Anyway, every time they debated the laws and they came to an agreement, Tehut would carve it into a piece of stone, and then later it would then be carved onto the obelisk of Uran. And you may have heard about that in a different story when Uran was overthrown and his obelisk was toppled. But yeah, that's a sad story. Anyway, the stories of the various universities are also very long, so I'm just going to focus on the story of Tehut the man, not Tehut the university or the location, because both the university and the location the university was placed in ended up being called Tehut. Bit confusing, I know, but hey, I didn't make the rules. Tehut founded the Institute of Philosophy and Chemistry. I know it sounds like an unusual combination to us, but in Tantal, it was just a natural combination. It was like the Institute of Great Knowledge. And I guess it may have later come to be called alchemy, but we never called it something like that. And he set it up with the help of his wife. Guess who that was? My grandmother. And initially, it was just a part of the great University of Tantal. But as I said before, the universities and the subject matters grew, and 9 out of the 12 universities moved to more convenient locations away from Tantal. Tehut built his university in the mountains near to the old village of Khem. It was at the suggestion of his wife. She loved the mountains near to the original village of Khem, and so an inaccessible location was sought, which was nestled in the mountains, where they would be safe from the crazy primitives who would raid their village in the past. Obviously, the University of Tehut was named after him as the founder. And what a place it was. Peaceful tranquility most of the time. Except when the scientist philosophers got all excited about something, which did happen quite often. And they'd run around and they'd jump about and they'd be like when a rugby team wins a match. It was really quite an amazing feeling to have solved some major problem or come up with some major theory, and they'd all got just so excited. Anyway, about the university, it was nestled in a valley amongst the mountains, and it couldn't be easily reached on foot, and it was chosen for that fact that you couldn't really get to it by foot. There was a path from the university that led up to the top of one of the highest points, which ended up being a lookout point with a large round stone table and stone bench seating. And that is where people would go to do their thinking or discussing or arguing or jumping about excitedly. It had a view of the lake, I think it was, or was it the sea? I think it was the lake. I'm not sure. But I also have a strong feeling that you could only just see the old village of Khem in the distance. But once again, I'm not 100% on that. It's just a vague kind of semi-memory. And the water, whether it was a lake or the sea, it did look a very long way away from that vantage point. But it was a beautiful view, very green area, and it was the whole part, though, both the university and the lookout was very high up. And the lookout, you looked the one way and you saw the water, and you looked the other way and you could see the university buildings. So as I said, most of Tehut was nestled in a gentle sloping valley between the mountains. There were not a lot of buildings and no true pyramids that I can remember, but there was a significant and very large obelisk with a pyramidal base. I'm not 100% sure, but I think most of the university was underground. Most of my memories, however, are from the big stone table with the great views. So I don't have many memories of actually within the university. The place was mainly cut into the rock, the bedrock, but also with a few blocks cut into buildings around the area. And I definitely do not remember any primitives nearby. Moving on. As for his wife, our grandmother, she was not just fundamental in the setting up of the University of Tehut, but she was also one of the key people at the great university. And she was a real driving force in much of the work being done. So not just at the University of Tehut, she was consulted on many other things. It probably sounds like there was some sort of family thing going on, but it wasn't just about the family of Uran. It was about having the best brains available at the time, and Uran tended to be related to some of the smartest people around. When Tehut moved to South America, I'm assuming it is South America, to set up his university, Uran would regularly visit. And there were so many great discoveries and achievements, and there was so much going on. But despite it being so wonderful, it didn't last. And 9,300 years later, there was the overthrow of Uran. As I said, it went really well for 9,300 years, and it felt like it would never end. There was so much to achieve, to learn, to be happy about, and yet some people were dissatisfied. There's an old saying from Yorkshire about a person who's always dissatisfied, even if things are good, and they won't be happy till their face is in the dirt. And I think that this means that if you are constantly dissatisfied unreasonably, then eventually you will have something to really be unhappy about. And that was the case with the people of Tantal. It didn't happen immediately after Uran was overthrown. Initially, Bela took over, and things did start to change, but it wasn't terrible. It pretty much continued for a while, very similar. But then Bela pulled back some of the universities back to Tantal. Tehut, the location, at that point became independent, and Tehut the person continued to live there, all off and on, until the final deluge. Tehut and his wife didn't return to Tantal much. Instead, they continued at Tehut the location and later went to Khem for a while to assist with some major projects, and then once again returned to Tehut. He continued on good terms with both Uran and with Bela, who was the person who took over from Uran. And it was kind of tricky because it was Bela who had overthrown Uran, obviously. But Uran was his best friend, and yet Bela was also a good friend. He was in fact one of Uran's children, born in Kron, hence the name Bela of Kron. And Bela was essentially like a grandchild to Tehut, and he was loved very much because remember, Tehut was married to Bela's grandmother. So as I said, Tehut remained on good terms with Bela. Let's just say they had an understanding. So when resources were stretched due to overpopulation, Bela undertook to build a giant version of their energy generation technology in Khem. It was, in fact, what we know as the Great Pyramid. Tehut was asked to be involved in its creation, and because he was so close to Bela, he did agree. He worked closely with other scientists from Tantal to create the structure that not only fulfilled the purpose of energy generation, but also had designed into it key mathematical formulae and measurements to communicate certain information to anyone who might later come along if, say, the civilization itself were to be destroyed. The deluge and the massive earthquake and tsunami, which destroyed Tantal completely and did damage much of Khem as well as other locations. And this occurred approximately 12,400 years ago. In the deluge, Tehut University was still mostly intact. It was nestled between mountains. The area to one side of the mountains was pretty much wiped out. Many died, but there were still plenty of survivors. Tehut was actually at his university when the most terrible part of the devastation struck. He made sure that his wife and as many of his people as possible were safe, but within that same day, to the utter surprise and astonishment of everyone, he said he had to leave. And he went to the Temple of Light to check on the Great One. Now, his family and everyone didn't realize where he was going at the time. They thought he was heading to Tantal, but he wasn't. He just immediately went to the Temple of Light. And I don't even think he'd returned there since leaving the place about 24,000 years earlier. But I could be wrong, but no one ever spoke of it. When he returned from the temple, he said that the Temple of Light stood as if nothing had happened. But it was the only thing still standing in the area. The devastation around it was massive, and yet it looked like normal, he said. When he reached the Great One, she acted as if it was all of no consequence, almost as if she expected it. I do not know much of what she said, but she was the one who advised Tehut to go to Khem with as many of his people as would go and help rebuild it. She said it would be there that the next civilization of greatness would be born. After the deluge, everything changed for everyone who survived. The feeling of loss was impossible to shake, but the sense of having to pull together for the future was even greater. So everyone who survived was expected to work towards getting humanity back on its feet. And that meant, by humanity, both the primitives and the original Tantals alike. Tehut and his wife then left his university, the one that was named after him, and with some students returned to Khem. In his time in Khem, he would make a lot of differences, and that really is quite a big story in its own right. But I will give you some of the critical highlights, but the whole story of Tehut in Khem would be at least another episode, maybe a few. But needless to say, both he and his wife made a great contribution to getting civilization restarted. The Tantal people in Khem, led by Tehut, walked a very fine line when it came to helping the people who were the primitives of Khem at the time. And they didn't want to be giving the primitives the technology because usually primitives misused it and tended to kill each other or even try to kill the Tantals themselves. So it was a fine line they were walking between helping the people and staying alive, basically. I was mainly in Neath at this time, but I did spend a few years in various other locations, helping out where I could. But I always tended to return to Neath. Even after moving to Khem towards the end of my life, I always expected that I would return to Neath. I worked alongside Tehut on many occasions, both in Khem and in other places, and it was he who devised a program to help set up written language around the world. He taught, he wrote many books, he advised the other locations, and he guided the primitives to act in a civilized manner, well, as best he could. And that, of course, was a bit of a constant uphill battle for him. But the thing he was most passionate about was helping the primitives who were living in Khem at the time, who later became the dynastic Egyptians, to actually help them repair and repurpose the pyramids of Giza. He wanted the repair to continue to include all the special mathematics, etc. as well as extra things that he added from his original version. Then everything changed for him when his wife, my beautiful grandmother, was killed in an accident on the Nile. Tehut withdrew into himself, but he continued writing, and he wrote many books. And when he'd achieved all that he'd set out to do, he simply chose to stop taking the cure, and then he died of old age. It could almost be described as a form of suicide. He just wanted to go to his love. It was very, very painful for him being apart from her. There was actually a belief, quite strongly held by the Tantals, that we would go to another plane to wait until we reincarnate. And the greatest fear of any Tantal person was to return as a primitive. Anyway, I deviate. He believed that he would return in another life and find his wife and continue to help humanity. He died about 2,000 years before me, and I can't help wonder if he came back. And if so, did he remember the past like I can remember it? But anyway, before I finish this episode, there are a few more things that I need to clarify. Firstly, the Great One. Both the Great One and Uran had a belief that it was necessary to have a state of being detached from the activities of the primitive people. Not to say that they didn't help. They did, but they didn't interfere. I know there might be a fine line between those two. Djehuti, on the other hand, who was the leader who came after Bela, I suspect his middle name, in fact, was Interfere. But I won't venture into much of that topic at this time. Needless to say, Djehuti did interfere. He interfered a lot. But as far as I know, Uran never met the Great One. Uran learnt that philosophy from Tehut. And yet, Tehut did not live by that philosophy completely. He was fundamental in the establishment of several cultures. So in my opinion, this was not completely consistent with Uran and the Great One's policy of non-interference. But it is interesting that the Great One suggested that Tehut go to Khem and help restart civilization. I don't know anything about the decisions that are behind the scenes on that, but it does seem inconsistent. Anyway, in terms of some of the things that he did, he would take a team of the younger philosophers to help a new primitive group form their own written language, and they'd base it on what little language they had already. I think he had about 10 teams that he trained up, and he would split his time between them. And while he was also the leader of both Khem and the location called Tehut, he still managed to keep quite a strong hold on what these 10 teams that he trained up were doing. 4 of these team leaders came from a place called Anas, and the rest were Tantals. They were either from Tantal, the city, or from one of the other Tantal locations. This is interesting because I have absolutely no idea where Anas is, and I have no regressions regarding this place at all. I don't know the relationship between it and Tantal. Seriously, it's just a name to me. Anyway, most languages, as I said, were based on the way that the primitives in that area already communicated. But once they had a written language, it was found that their development towards civilization rapidly improved. In Khem, as with the other locations, they created a language with the primitives, who used words that they already had and developed any further syntax together and created that written language that was easy for them to understand and adapt to. Often it would be a picture that would represent a word, and then the language could develop from there.